Officially, this is the question that came in. Last DDL time is... Officially, this is the question that came in. Last DDL time is... censored word, it's broken. I'll rephrase that into something that maybe is a bit more delicate for our viewers. We use the last DDL time to detect changes on objects in our data warehouse, but it does not always seem to change when we think it should. What's going on? Initially, I thought, well, this doesn't, this sounds ridiculous. That's, last DDL time is something I've used a lot in the past. But there are some idiosyncrasies to be aware of, which I only discovered when I actually had some back and forth with this customer after calming them down a little bit. And on that note, I thought I'd show these things to you, and so you're aware of them yourself, and we'll do some exploring. So let's walk through the last DDL time column on user objects. I'll start with a simple table. Create a table called T, create an index on T, throw some rows in there so we actually have some real segments on our database. So we have a table called T, an index called IX. I'm going to set my endless date format to being longer such that we can see down to the second when things change. Just makes it easier to track the last DDL time. And here we are. It's 9:27 p.m. in Perth here, and we can see that we created my table T at 3 seconds past the minute, and my index followed suit 10 seconds later at 21:27:13. Let's set the index to unusable. So this person had a data warehouse. They were making their indexes unusable so they could load data in. If I look at the DDL, first idiosyncrasy, making an index unusable on a table tweaks the last DDL time on both the index and the table. So the table gets marked as changed as well. That's the first thing we should be aware of. If I rebuild the index, then once again, both the table and the index get flagged as, yep, you've actually made an alteration to both of these objects. First idiosyncrasy to be aware of is just playing with the index may update the table DDL as well. Let's now drop that table and make things a little bit more complicated. I'll now create a table which has partitions, and I'll create a local index on that partition table. Now, when we look in user objects, we actually have 6 things to look at. We have the index and the table themselves. That's the ones with sub-object name of null. And then we have the partitions for each of those segments as well. So we have P1 and P2 for the index and P1 and P2 for the table. And we can see that 30 seconds past the minute, I created the table, and at 36 seconds past the minute, I created the index and its partitions. Let's take one of the partitions of that index and make it unusable and see what we get. The index itself has been changed its DDL time, as has the partition we touched. The other partition remains unchanged at 36 seconds past the minute. The table also gets marked as having changed, but in this case, the equivalent table partition does not. So just the table at the highest level gets marked as having DDL, plus the index, plus the partition that we actually tweaked. If I rebuild that partition, let's see what happens. So now, interestingly here is the index at the high level didn't get changed now. So it got left untouched. The index partition we rebuilt did get updated. It's now 46 seconds past the minute. And the table partitions are also remain untouched. So unlike the non-partitioned example, where whatever it is, the index always tweak the table and the index, here, setting unusable tweaks the index, the partition, and the table. Rebuilding only tweaks the partition concerned of the index. So some interesting things we get here. Let's now go to one layer deeper again. Drop my table. Now I'm going to have partitions and subpartitions. So I've got 2 layers of partitioning now. I'll create an index, local index, so it's got all the same partitioning structure as the table, load in some data. Let's look at our DDL, and we can see here that I've got a table and an index because I ran them all straight away. They're all at 29 seconds past the minute. They all have the same DDL time. Let's change one of the subpartitions of the index to be unusable. And if we have a look, what happened? The index at the highest level got tweaked. It's now 56 seconds past, as was the table, 56 seconds past. But the subpartition we actually tweaked has had no change to its DDL time. It is not registered at all. It's just the highest level index and table. The subpartition is you're blissfully unaware that you actually made it unusable. Let's rebuild that partition now. When I rebuild it, the index at the highest level gets marked as you've had a change, but nothing else. The partition you just rebuilt, you haven't done a DDL to it. The table that holds that index, no DDL as well. The only thing they got tagged as as a fresh DDL was the actual index at the highest level. It's all quite odd, really. Let's go back to the slides. So there are definitely some idiosyncrasies to be aware of. And these are just ones I discovered when tinkering around with partitions and subpartitions. There are probably other scenarios as well. Things like you might have, for example, a partition table with lob segments, or just a table with lob segments, and you might do something to the lob, but maybe not the table, etc. I haven't explored those, but there are probably other scenarios. The only thing I'd probably suggest here is that, and I'm tempted to log bugs for these because I think people have a right to think that whatever level object they touch, that should probably tweak the last DDL time. So I'll probably log some bugs for that and speak to the developers, but no guarantees. But one thing I would recommend is if you're actively using last DDL time to see if things have changed in your database, then generally, as you can see, you want to be tracking things at the object level, not the sub-object level. So you really can't trust partition level stuff or sub-partition level stuff. Always be looking at the highest level. The index at the highest level is the only thing you could reliably trust as always being tweaked for its DDL time. So just be aware of that. And I probably would question the philosophy of using last DDL time as some sort of particular flag to detect if you need to do changes. If I'm setting something to unusable, then I would imagine that I would be looking for a status of unusable on my indexes to decide what I need to rebuild, not whether the last DDL time has been tweaked. But I think it's important to realize that you can't simply say, if something doesn't have a last DDL time change, then it hasn't been altered. We've just seen there that it might still be the case that changes have been done.